Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the movie The Guilty. So, this is of course a Jake Gyllenhaal film, hence why I put it up there. Letting everybody know that this movie is soon to be coming to Netflix, but if you don't want to wait that amount of time for The Guilty to be presented upon Netflix, you could go out of your way to say that you've seen this film by going into two separate apps. There, in fact, you can go into an app called Yes Movies. If you go and you search into Google Play and you go out of your way to click and search for Yes Movies, if you go into an app that says Yes Movies and Shows, you should pretty much be able to see anything that you want. Whether it's a Showtime show, an HBO Max, whichever, like, you can basically see anything through that app. There's another app called Fox HD Movies. If you Google search Fox HD Movies, should probably come up with the secondary app fairly quickly and right away. And then you should finally be able to say that you can pretty much be able to see whatever you want. But how did I feel about The Guilty? Well, I like a lot of people might like 911 dispatcher movies. Some people may have even heard of the Halle Berry movie called The Call that was done in 2013. And really, this movie kind of reminded me of the Ryan Reynolds film Buried, where Ryan Reynolds was to be buried alive and was to have to consistently call people to try and help him get out of this situation. And like that was a much more kind of thrill ride experience for me, which eventually kind of also had a thrill ride of going on into this film, where, of course, probably like the movie The Call, the 2013 film. So Jake Gyllenhaal is to be stuck as a 911 dispatcher, and it seems like there is to have been a fire going on that is to hog up a lot of people, because a lot of people are to be busy on this day because there is some kind of like forest fire or some kind of fire of sorts that is going on. It seems that also Joe Baylor, who is to be Jake Gyllenhaal's character, is to seemingly get a consistent call from a reporter while he's doing his job. And it seems that eventually we find out that Joe is to be possibly soon going back to his job, I guess, as a beat cop, I'm assuming. Because it seems that he was stuck doing this job because of some court case that he is soon to be involved in. So it seems that eventually, once this story is to play out, eventually we're naturally assuming one thing, and then all of a sudden we are to eventually understand what is really going on in this film. And then we're like, whoa! So like we're kind of thinking that this movie is to be done some way to all of a sudden have it be flipped, where even Joe Baylor, we can't maybe trust this character, so to speak. But yeah, so I enjoy this movie, and some people may not. Some people may find it too boring or too long of a stretch of a film, or some people may not enjoy 911 dispatcher kind of films. So going into this, I would say thrill ride. It's a really interesting film, and there is something here that I really did enjoy once I saw it. So with that said, I think it's about customary time to just go into spoilers, just talk about this thing. Uh, Really, there were some interesting cast choices for who was on the other side of the phone. We had freaking, like, Ethan Hawke was one of the voices, evidently, from a part of this phone, who was to be the sergeant character. There seemed to have also been certain other characters, like Peter Sargard was playing the voice of Henry, which a lot of people might be familiar with Peter when he was to have been in the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern movie as the villain. So yeah, so let's go into this. Let's go into that double five time territory because it's that customary time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we do spoil this movie. So, so Jake, Joe Baylor is to of course be this 911 operator. He is to kind of get all these kind of just random like calls that eventually he's to go into his computer and there seems to be some easy cases at first that he is to quickly be able to solve, and eventually at one point Joe is to have to call a familiar face to him, a guy named Sergeant Bill Miller, and all of a sudden, like Joe is to realize that he's talking to one of his superiors, and he's like, "Oh, hey, Sergeant, Sarge, like, hey, great!" Like, hearing a familiar or hearing a familiar voice. So there is to be a guy that was to eventually call the police, and it seems someone had uh, like robbed him from his car. And so Joe is trying to ask him like, okay, where are you? Like, what car are you in? Like, what is your license plate? And this guy's like, I'm not going to get out of my car. Like, do you not understand that? Like, he says that numerous times, like, I'm not going to get out of my car. And it's like, well, Jake is like, or Joe Baylor is like, well, I need to know where you are. Like, like there's a lot of times where immediately they are to GPS them and to ask them, okay, can you confirm to me that you're at this location? So, and sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. So immediately you have a 911 operator that is to tell them to get out of their car to make sure, or get out of the whatever place that they are to make sure that their address is where they are, so that way they don't send the police to the wrong place. So, uh, so this guy who is to have called Jake is to have his computer stolen, and so Sarge is to have somebody come on over to find this guy to figure out this case. Because a lot of times you have Joe's character who kind of transitions these things to other places like fire or ambulance or whichever. So, uh, so the very beginning of this movie, we have Jake who is to, I guess, be an asthmatic. It seems like he puts an inhaler to his mouth and is to get ready for his workday because, of course, his workday is going to be very stressful. And it's just like, oh God, another day of this, another day of just being stressed out. Like, it would be interesting if we would have gotten like a play by play of like several days of whatever he is to do of this, and then eventually we come to this. Like, it would have been better if there was kind of a play out where we got a little bit of like the day to day, and then all of a sudden we get the one big call. So so the next, like, let's get to the big call. Uh so Joe is to eventually get this call from this woman named Emily. And so Emily is to mention that she is to have been abducted, and supposedly she is to have been uh, like trying to call to try to get help. But here's the thing, she keeps trying to mention like her daughter, or that her daughter's okay, because Emily is to try to call her daughter, supposedly, but instead she's really calling Joe. Like, this is the whole like ordering the pizza scenario where someone would say like, "Hey, I'm calling like the pizza so that way we can all get some pizza," and really like what the person is actually doing is calling the police. So eventually that happens a lot. Like you can like supposedly there's some secret way of uh of getting information out of that. There was some kind of real life scenario where somebody did order a pizza to try to get help. And so like that was a cool scenario uh from real life. But so Jake is to consistently tell this woman that like okay, like considering like you're supposedly talking to your daughter, like try to keep me on the phone for as long as possible. Like comfort your daughter, like say things like to your daughter to me. So Jake or Joe is to now start to ask this woman yes or no questions because he doesn't know like what's really going on. So eventually Joe is to ask Emily. It's like, well, is the person that you're with armed? And so she's say yes. And so uh, let me pause here for a second. Okay, it's like I did. It's something I had to deal with. Anyways, so pushing on. Uh, so we have Joe who ends up calling Emily, or Emily calls, and so Joe, while kind of figuring things out, is to start to get some information, but not quite enough. Like the real thing that he needs, because Joe eventually asks her, like, okay, like, tell me what kind of vehicle does your abductor have? Like, when I'm to basically tell the color, say yes. And so he's like green, blue, red, white, and she says yes to white, and then he's like, okay, when I'm to say which vehicle it is, say yes or no. So eventually he ends up saying van, and she says van, and he's like, don't say what it is, just like really just continue on to just say yes or no and comfort me, like pretend I'm your child. So eventually Joe is to try to put as much information out as much as possible, but then eventually Emily is to hang up. So eventually Joe is to call the dispatchers or the police and just be like, okay, well, I have a woman who's been abducted, and supposedly he is to have a knife, and or no, wait, he I think Joe mentions knife when he ends up calling Abby, which is Emily's daughter. So, uh, so Joe is to eventually kind of relay this message, but like here's the problem: specifically where they are at is to have been this fire, so that way they can't. There's like too much smoke going on. They can't really tell, uh, like where this is because there's a fire going on. So they can't really tell what color a van is. Something like silver or white. They can't tell the difference because there's too much going on. There's too much gust of either smoke or too much gust of like ash that is probably coming from wherever this public fire is, which is displayed upon the news upon this big wall of things going on. So we have Jake who is just to be like really aggressive about this call, and we have his boss kind of wrangling him in whenever he's to do something he's not supposed to, like take phone calls or do any number of things. So Joe eventually, after not being able to get in touch uh, with Emily, ends up deciding to call Abby, which is his daughter, and or which is Emily's daughter. I mean, so Joe calls Emily's daughter and is to ask her about information because she's the only one seemingly home. And so it seems that Emily is to have a brother, and so Joe's like, okay, like, all right. So go and spend time with your brother, because evidently, like, Joe was trying to calm this girl down by saying, like, hey, go and watch some TV, or just try to do something comfortable while you're talking to me. The TV is broken, so Joe tells this girl to go to her brother, to try to seek comfort that way. And because Abby just says that her brother is sleeping, and so it's like, okay, what does sleeping exactly mean? So eventually, Joe is to eventually get more information. That it seems that both the mother and father are to have gone out. So we start to have Joe, who all of a sudden is to look up the husband's information, who is Henry, and then finds his license plate, and so he then puts Abby on hold to eventually call the police and to mention, like, okay, now I have a license plate. Go and look for this specific license plate of this white van. Blah blah blah, and Abby is to also try to comfort this girl and to say that, like, they will find and protect her mother, and that everything will be okay. And so we have Joe, who is trying to relay all this to this dispatcher, who is to get some police out and to be sent for this van. And we also have Joe, who wants to have them go on to also go and send a car out to Abby's home, or Abby, who is just at home. And so when he is to try to convey this to this person who's going to eventually transition, this is like the FHP, or the police department. So when Joe is to relay this to the police department, whoever is to kind of wrangle and kind of tell everybody where to go, uh, she is to say, it's like, well, we'll go and we'll look for this van. Like, we don't have the people to go and handle that other thing. Like, whatever, like, you're asking for way too much. So eventually Joe turns around and ends up calling his sergeant, and he ends up telling his sergeant about all this. And so they end up sending a thing out, like some police to go to Abby's home. So uh, so we have Joe, who ends up holding on for this girl, and so there are to be two police officers that end up coming into the home, and all of a sudden they end up finding out that the girl has a lot of blood on her hands, and so they're asking, it's like, oh, well, like, is this your blood, little girl? And so like, there is no confirmation, there is no whatever. All of a sudden, the officers head more into the home, and all of a sudden, we just find that the phone is to have been hanged up upon, because, like, I guess there was some horrific scene that they were to see that they had to hang up on. So now Jake is taking a real interest in this, and also there was to be a spot before Jake was to get this call, that eventually he was trying to call his wife to ask her, hey, if like, my daughter is still awake, can I, like, tell her good night, or could I speak to her? And so eventually, sometime later, while Jake is still haggling with this case, eventually his wife is to call, and it seems like they're on poor terms with one another. It seems like they have probably separated or whichever, and it seems that for Joe's daughter Jess, or his daughter, to, because I think Jess is actually his wife, I believe. Um, yeah. yeah, I just wanted to confirm that. So, so Jess evidently, like, Joe just wanted to talk to his daughter, and that led nowhere. So Joe is to eventually talk to Jess and to ask, like, hey, like, how are things going? When are you going to get this job interview? And, or how did the job interview go? And Jess is to mention, it's like, well, that job interview is until next week. And Joe is like, well, like, I've just been sitting at this Airbnb, and like I can't tell like what day it is. Like I have like no clue. Like every day just blends together. I just sit back and I just watch TV because there's nothing better to do. And so like Joe just wanted to just call his daughter, and Jess mentions it's like, well, it's 2 in the morning, like your daughter is asleep, like no. So but Joe just wanted to just wanted to talk to his daughter because he has a case tomorrow that might lead him into eventually being in jail for who knows how long. And so that's the reason why he wanted to call his daughter. Also, Joe was to mention that he hopes that his supposed wife that he is talking to is to be at court with him, because it'll look good if Joe's wife is technically there. So that's when Jess just hangs up because it's like, dude, I'm not gonna help you. Like, I'm not gonna like, I'm not gonna help do what you're doing, or do whatever. So we also have a moment where since Joe can't go and have them break into Henry's home because Henry has a separate home or apartment or whatever. Uh, Joe is to call his partner or his former partner, a guy named Rick. And so Joe is to eventually call Rick and have him go to the other apartment where the other police would not go to because they're too busy. So Rick eventually gets into this home that evidently had a dog there, and then eventually he tries to scramble through some of the mail that these people are to have. So eventually Joe is to go and do like go away from where he is in the very early stages of this movie. He had his own little 911 section, but he ends up going into this private little wing, this private little office, and he ends up trying to do what he does without having people kind of bug him. Because he asked one of his coworkers, who is Manny, uh, about like, hey, if I wanted to eventually like do the exact same thing on my computer, like, can I just go to this other spot? And Manny's like, yeah, if you are still logged in and you go into another computer and log in, like, if anything, everything that'll be on your computer now will be on whatever other computer. Because Joe was trying to get information from Manny, and so that's why he wanted to technically just be nice with him. Just say, hey man, how about we go and grab some beers after this shift is over? Which evidently was supposed to be like 10 to 15 minutes. But then eventually Jake, or Joe's character, kept hanging on to this one phone call, or this one kind of 911 situation, that he just like he stayed there for however long to just finish this up. So eventually eventually Joe calls Henry to try and get Henry to stop what he's doing, and Henry just continues to like either hang up the phone, or it seems that Joe is trying to reason with Henry to just be like, hey, like, why aren't you like, did you know that your kids are home alone? Like, aren't you gonna go and check on them? And Henry's like, no, like, I'm busy right now. He's like, you're too busy to check on your kids? And so like Joe's trying to wrangle Henry back to his home, or to try and have Henry go back and do something that he's not supposed to, or that Henry really wants to. So Joe continues to try to call Henry, and he immediately goes to voicemail. So he tries to call Emily, immediately goes to voicemail. So there's a whole lot of issues where like Joe is kind of left in the dark, kind of trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and like it doesn't really seem like there is much information. So, but eventually Emily does call, as Joe was to like scramble and to ask any of the other people, like, "Hey, has Emily called any one of you?" And everyone is to say no. So Joe eventually is to go on and is to go in his private wing and is to eventually find out that it's the bad guy isn't actually Henry in this scenario, it's actually Emily. Because Emily is to be in the back part of this van, and Joe was to mention to Emily, it's like, well, it seems like we can't find you, so if anything, go and find some instrument or some kind of blunt instrument or something to hit Henry because technically he deserves it and escape out of there. And then all of a sudden, we end up finding out while Joe is to be calling Emily and getting a hold of her, eventually it seems that Emily isn't all quite that there, or she isn't all quite that rational or sane, um, because we have Joe who is desperately trying to ask her about a fun moment with like whatever like she's ever done with her free time or something that she's ever done with the kids. Like think of a happy moment, and this girl is to talk about the aquarium and talk about like the fishes and the whatever, and eventually like Joe was to ask her about like what about the sharks, do you like the sharks, just to kind of keep her calm. So eventually this eventually Emily is to seem not all quite that rational the more that Joe is to really talk to her, and eventually we find out that Emily had seemed to figure out that her son had snakes inside of him. So Emily had to take the snakes out of supposedly her son's body, and supposedly she had maybe hurt her son. And so now we're naturally assuming, okay, like this girl is not all that rational. It seems that she had been in a psychiatric thing before. It also seemed like Henry had spent 12 months in a prison before, and Jake was naturally assuming that the villain was actually Henry, but it was actually Emily the whole time. Henry, I guess, was just trying to protect her, or was naturally assuming that if Emily was going to do something wrong, that all of a sudden Henry was going to go to prison also, because of what she did. So, uh, so eventually now, Emily had gotten away from Henry and is supposedly at this overpass. And so now, since Joe is to be on this phone with Emily, trying to keep her on the phone because it seems like she is going to quite possibly injure herself or other people. Who knows? Maybe uh, any rational person would probably say like she might get hit by a car or she might drop into a overpass part and whatever and get run over. Who knows? So Joe is scrambling to tell anybody like out of this office like, hey, call the dispatch and call the police and like mention to them that there is to be a woman that is to be just wandering over the overpass. This is this girl named Emily, who I've been contacting to or been in contact with. So, uh, because they can't actually get a location of where these people are. Every single time Joe was to ask them about some street address or some kind of something, and they give him nothing. There was also some point where Joe was waiting for Emily to call, and all of a sudden there was to be some guy who fell off his bike and hurt his knee, and Joe mentioned like, "Hey, call an Uber and freaking go to the hospital. Like, who cares about your bike injury?" Uh, and there was also to be some other moment where some guy was to call for some reason, but eventually this guy was to be rude to Joe's character, and Joe was to be rude back. Just be like, well, F you then. Like, I'm not going to help you. Like, freaking, like, and hangs up the phone. So eventually we get where the police officers are eventually scoop up Emily and solve this whole case. And before we do, we have Joe, who is to try and keep Emily from hurting herself. And let me pause here for just a quick second again. So, the last thing that Joe is to tell Emily before she ended up getting grabbed by the police, Joe was to confess that evidently he had hurt a kid. He had hurt this really young kid, which I guess was to lead him to be separated from his wife and his kid. And so eventually Jake is to have called his partner, and because his partner is to be a witness to everything that is going to happen tomorrow with Joe's court hearing, because evidently it is to be whether or not that Joe had hurt this kid or not. So Joe confesses to this woman that he had hurt a kid, and because evidently this kid had hurt someone else. So it seems very vague. It kind of feels like the story isn't all exactly there, and but Emily is just like, oh, like did you hurt him with snakes? And Jake just says, or Joe just says yes, like even though he didn't really hurt him with snakes. So like there's a whole weird like problem I think with this story where there isn't exact like things of what actually is to happen there. But so Jake eventually confesses to this girl about what had happened, that he had killed this young boy, and to try to get Emily to calm down. And so Emily ended up being found, and so there was to be Jake's or Joe's boss that is to confirm all this, that she was found, and that eventually, like, I guess a broken person was to find a broken or help a broken person. So I guess Joe was to be that broken person in that scenario. So eventually, Joe, after this whole thing is to be solved, he ends up going to the bathroom. He ends up barfing. He ends up doing a thing of his inhaler. It seems like there's quite a few times where he's to tell like Emily to breathe, but then he has a problem and he needs his inhaler. So eventually Joe is to barf in the toilet, and then eventually he's to call his partner, and like his partner is just kind of driving around because he thought that maybe Joe still needed him for something. And Joe is like, just go home, man. Just go home. So Joe is to tell Rick before we are to leave here in this movie, like, hey, man, tell everyone the truth. Like, tell them the truth about what happened. And Rick is like, well, I can't do that. I can't change my statement. And Joe is just like, man, just tell the truth. And Rick is like, well, you'll be gone. You'll be going to prison for a very long time. Joe's like, I don't care. Just tell him the truth. So Rick is just like, well, okay. So Joe is to finally call this reporter that has been calling him all day for statements and whatever. And so Joe is to confess everything that happened to this reporter. And so that is to be the last thing that we actually see of Jake or Joe. So the next thing that we end up seeing is like this just supposedly picture of this town, and we are to be confirmed that Joe had pleaded guilty to all the things which that he had done, and will be sent away for jail for X amount of time. and so evidently he had confessed to all this via a report, and so this guy is going to be going away for however long because he is to have told the truth. So that he had done whatever this was, because eventually, like, he confessed to this woman, this stranger, so I guess he might as well confess again and tell the truth and tell everybody what had happened. So with that said, like, in a roundabout way, I reviewed this film. It's not going to be perfect because there's a lot of elements going into here. A lot of stuff just kind of seems like the same thing over and over and over again. But where it's just kind of like, okay, Joe at some points is kind of waiting around for either like him having to consistently try and call Henry, or him having to consistently call Emily, or him trying to get a hold of someone to eventually try and get them to do something, which eventually he gets upset about or aggressive about certain things, telling people what their job is, to where eventually some people like say back, it's like, hey man, like, don't tell me how to do my job. And it's like, okay, all right, just do it. Just go, just do this. Just do it. Go ahead. So there is to be all that happening. There was to be one spot where eventually Joe was to try to call Henry, and Henry was to now be the victim. And so, like, Joe has to kind of apologize to Henry because he thought that Henry was the bad guy. He thought Henry was the villain. So now Joe is to try to get some information from Henry because he wants to help him, and Henry's like, no one can help us. Like, no one can ever help us. So evidently there's to be some kind of screw loose going on with this guy also, I guess, or assume, or whatever. But yeah, I think I covered everything, but there's too much to cover in this movie. There's a lot of just detailed, microscopic details that go into this film. It's a really interesting film. It's very, like, one of those kind of, like, I wish it was a lot more, like, there's a lot more, like, scary stuff going on in this film. I honestly think that the Halle Berry movie, The Call, was a little bit better. I liked that kind of setup a little bit better. It's an easier movie to have reviewed compared to this one. This one kind of jumps a lot. It kind of goes all over the place, and it gets really confusing because there's too many elements to talk about. And there's too many details. There's too many microscopic details to go into this film with. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Hopefully this is to be kind of covered somehow or another. It was a challenging movie to review because it was just like, oh my god, there's a lot of just details to do whatever. I probably could have, like, really scripted or noted this down, but I was just like, nah. Like, it's a 911 call kind of movie. It's either people are interested or people could care less. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.